I'm glad you had me do this. I think you had the hope that as your brother I would be doing softball questions.
I did.
I have a secret agenda of trapping you into saying something silly.
In the grand tradition of former YC presidents, I will try to say something completely innocuous and have the press hammer me for it.
I'm excited. That's my goal. And then we'll try to have time for questions at the end. But I do have some questions, so we'll get into it.
Okay.
So yesterday was an exciting press day. You announced transitioning YC to Jeff Ralston. You've done it for 5 years. It's a really different place than when you joined. So I would love to hear, what are you most proud of, and what do you most regret?
I think the thing that I'm most proud of is we really built an empire in a way that I think has not happened many times in investing. We treated it like trying to build a company, not make investments, and we sort of had a strategy, and we ran it like we would advise companies to build a competitive moat and an advantage and a brand and a network. And I think we did that really well. And I'm proud of the team, of course, and the founders that we fund most of all. But I think we came together with the strategy and built something that has created a ton of value and will do so for a long time in the future. There's always like lots of regrets, but I think the biggest one, to a much lesser extent, in the same way that the president of the US is sort of the effective leader of the party, or the real leader of the party, I think the president of YC is sort of the unofficial leader of the startup movement. And I think there's a lot of things that have gone wrong in the startup movement, and I feel some degree of personal responsibility for that. And the one that bothers me most of all is I think the motive, as starting a startup has gone from this sort of outsider thing to basically the equivalent of going into banking or consulting when you graduate an elite college. I think the motivation of founders has gotten off, and I feel some personal responsibility that we weren't able to do everything we could to grow the startup ecosystem and also really imbue the culture that and sort of the right motivations for starting a startup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll get into this more, but I guess also sort of, so that's 5 years back. Zooming back 15 years when you started your company, Silicon Valley was a very different place. How do you feel about the state of startups? Is it what you expected it would be in 2019? Is it what you hoped for?
No. I think the saddest thing, or the thing that I feel most, that I wish were most different, is I think people are starting insufficiently ambitious startups and are operating on an insufficiently long time frame. I think the biggest opportunity in startups is people who are willing to take a very long time frame, work on very hard, intensive, capital-intensive, resource-intensive, talent-intensive, whatever problems. And I think I would have expected, as sort of startups became canonized and sort of professionalized, that you would see people willing to do harder things and take more risk and sort of have more Manhattan Project-like startups or Apollo Project-like startups. And I think we've actually seen less and less. And that, I think, is not what the world needs right now. It's also sort of not what I find personally interesting. One of the things that I always tried to do at YC was push towards more of the hard tech startups. And I think the community has gone away from that. That said, I'm much more positive than negative as a whole. I think it's remarkable, it's incredible what has happened about how easy it has become to start a startup, how often people start things that look like toys and go on to become these like monsters like Airbnb. And if you think about how much the world has changed in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, and how much of that change has been driven by startups, and how dependent we all are on services that didn't exist 20 years ago, companies that didn't really exist 20 years ago, I think that's incredible. So I'm net much happier than if we didn't have the whole startup movement, but I would like to see it become more ambitious again.
Do you think that this has been sort of a necessary part of the tech innovation and deployment sort of phase like Carlota Perez talks about? Or do you think that there's something that YC or other sort of institutions could be doing differently to sort of change the course?
I think it's really up to entrepreneurs to change the course. I think YC and other people can continue to talk about what could be different. But it really comes down to like what the best entrepreneurs in the world decide to work on, and we can try to convince them. KV and others can try to convince them, and we all should. But I think one thing that's happened that is a little bit, what's the word? I think a lot of the discovery phase of how to start a startup has been figured out. It doesn't feel like a frontier anymore. At this point, it feels like there is a playbook, and if you want to be a founder, there's this set of things you can do. It's very well explained online by many different people, and you can follow that. And if you do it a few times and get lucky, at some point it will probably work. And that is a tempting thing to do in the way that it used to be tempting to be a banker or consultant. And so that siren song, I think, people away from sort of more uncertain, the part of the map where it says, warning, there's dragons here. But that's like the fun area to work at, for me at least, and I think for some other people as well. And I think what will happen is startups in the sort of the traditional sense, or the sense now that has become commonplace, will become a more normal career path. And then there will be some people doing things like OpenAI or plenty of other companies that sound non-standard.
That makes that scarier is in some ways what you're saying is doing a sort of normal startup feels safe, and doing some of the bigger things is scary. You've had this sort of willingness to be wrong a lot. I don't know that everyone necessarily has that, and I wonder if that's what it takes.
Well, I think that's, again, like, I think most people want to do something that is like a relatively well understood path that other people are on as well. And I think it is kind of cool that like starting a startup has been so figured out that it is no longer considered a super risky career option, but it's something that like tens of thousands of people apply to YC to do every year. And then so that'll be what a lot of people do, and that's fine, that's good. And then there will be some people who are like, I'm going to go do this other thing and start this very other kind of company, or really take a long-term horizon on research. But I think that's all okay. I think it is important to me personally and to other people I've met to be willing to not necessarily be wrong, but have other people think you're wrong for years and then turn out to be right. And that was what it felt like when I started a company, and I loved that feeling. And I think that is still the way that most of the value in the world gets created. I think when everyone thinks I'm doing something that makes obvious sense or is definitely going to work, or is what I should be doing, I always get quite suspicious.
How can entrepreneurs build the sort of the resolve to not care for, or to be unaffected for years if people think they're wrong?
Yeah, so I think this is actually, the normal advice here is this is something you're either born with or not. I don't think that's true. I think people have to build up their own confidence slowly over time by having a deeply held conviction, having people tell them they thought it was wrong, it didn't make sense, and then being proven right. And then it happens again and again and again. And each time it happens, you trust yourself a little more. You are willing to take a little bit more risk. You're willing to like take a little bit of a longer term bet, have people think you're wrong for longer. And eventually, you build up the confidence that you will be wrong sometimes, but when you're right and everyone else thinks you're wrong, those are the opportunities where the most value gets created, and it's worth it to be wrong some significant percentage of the time if you can be like breathtakingly right and against the crowd occasionally. And another thing I think there that is helpful is to find a crew. Like one of the things that is hardest about being a startup CEO is not having peers. And one of the things that YC got right accidentally is we gave CEOs peers, the other people in the batch. And I have been lucky to have sort of a crew of conspirators to work with that even when sort of like most of the world thought I or they were doing something wrong, we could sort of like rely on each other. And I think it is useful to find people who have that sort of shared spirit.
I have one more question on this topic,
Sure.
and related to this and to YC. And it's related to something that Vinod has talked about that I think is very powerful, which is entrepreneurs approaching big projects like climbing Everest, and that there's this difference between a $0 million company and a $0 billion company, and that you don't need to know the exact course, but more or less you should have this big plan. To me, in a certain way, that seems not at odds, but different from a type of YC advice that I hear a lot, which is solve a very niche, narrow problem, and then sort of trust the process that you'll expand from there. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think they're really at odds. I think in both cases you're saying, like, you want to go to the top of the mountain. You can see the top of the mountain, you can see the first base camp, and you can't see the things in between. You can't see the path in between. And what we always tell founders is, like, have the ambition, have some sort of vision for how the company can be huge. Know what you're going to do first, and then be flexible in tactics and where you expand, but like keep going up. Don't go to the side, or don't sort of stop when you get to base camp. And that was always how I ran YC, which is that like we had a strategy that we talked about all of the time, and the strategy was that over time, capital and advice would commoditize, and the only way to build a durable advantage in investing was going to be to build a network effect, which is what we tell any company. Like network effects are the best competitive advantage when you can have them. And so now when people ask, like, oh, like, people almost, they're like, this thing that happened at YC is so cool, like, was that an accident? It was like, no, of course we planned it. And like, what does it mean that you as an investor, like, are so surprised that we planned it? I think investors run their own operations most of the time extremely differently than the advice they give to their founders. They view decisions as sort of these one-off, like, oh, we're gonna like work on this deal, but there's not really a cohesive strategy most of the time. There is not a long-term plan to build enduring value. In fact, most of the things that investors tell founders to do, build a team, like, you know, have a succession plan, like, it usually doesn't happen, KV an exception. But it's surprisingly rare, and that point has really been driven home for me, given the apparent, and I think genuine surprise of other investors reacting to the fact that, like, we had a strategy all along, and that we were trying to build something of enduring value and not just something that sort of is good at stock picking. And I think there's a real lesson there if anyone wants to start a new investing firm, which is you can play a game other people aren't playing.
And I want to come back to this if we have time, but I want to make sure that I ask a couple questions about OpenAI too, because you have a new job now.
I do. Well, I've had it for a while, but now I have, yeah, I can focus on it more.
So OpenAI, you've got sort of like a mission statement.
Yeah.
It's like, what is the mission of OpenAI?
We want to build safe artificial general intelligence and figure out how to maximally spread the benefits among humanity. I think that building true AI, something that is genuinely smarter and more capable than humans in every way, will be the most important thing humanity ever does. And I think if we don't have wide input into how we want this transition to go, and a wide sharing of the benefits, and make sure that it's sort of like human positive, that's really bad. And the upside of doing all that is really good. Like, we can solve any problem we can imagine.
So just curious of, like, going into this, I know it's been going for a while, but going into the project, I'm curious, what is your sort of level of conviction right now that AI will sort of wake up? And when do you feel that will happen?
You know, the wake-up question is harder because consciousness is so poorly defined. But my level of conviction that AI will eventually surpass human intelligence, unless we destroy ourselves first, is 100%. It will happen. The timing question is much harder. And I don't think it matters that much. There are these huge debates in the field about, are we 10 years away or 50 years away, or mostly in that range, I would say. And like, again, for this most important moment in human history to be that close, whether it's 10 or 50 years away, I don't think is super relevant, and I think speaks to a problem of time horizons in the tech industry, because that is the blink of an eye, and everything is going to be different on the other side of that. And we should all, I think, at least decide it for myself, like, once you believe that, it's hard for me to work on anything else. And the fact that there's so much debate about the timeframes when everyone agrees that they're that relatively short is surprising, and I think indicative of this other problem.
What would you say is sort of different in your motivations now in starting something like OpenAI versus, you know, in motivations you had during Looped or YC, if those were similar? Like, just to try to find what the thing is that would kind of inspire more of these types of things.
So Looped was not, that was like, that kind of just happened. I didn't have like I didn't give it a lot of foresight. I was just like hacking on this project. I really liked it. It became a company. YC, I definitely was like, okay, how can we build this sort of engine of innovation to do lots of things? And it'd be easy for me to tell the story, which is like, I always knew AI was the one that was gonna work the best. And there's some truth to that because, I don't know if you remember this, when I was a kid, I was like really into sci-fi and AI. You do, yeah. And I always thought that would happen someday. But when we started working at OpenAI, I didn't know it was gonna work. And there were like lots of other projects that I also had high conviction might work. But when it became clear to me that I thought we actually had a plan to get from here to AGI, then it was clear that that was what I wanted to work on.
What are the other areas where there are projects like OpenAI that could be happening now that aren't?
So I think there should be like much more investment into nuclear energy. I think there should be much more investment into carbon capture. I think we will figure out a number of real-time diagnostics of humans that look at a molecular level all the time and sort of answer daily, weekly, monthly, just diagnostics of everything going on in your body. I think that there will be, synthetic biology should be a revolution in terms of how a lot of things get made at massive scale. There's a very long list of this stuff, and I agree with you, not much of it is happening, or not enough of it is happening.
And why doesn't it? Like, why don't these projects happen?
So I had this observation, and when I took over YC, like one of the things that I tried to do was really push towards more hard tech companies. And in the year that I started, the year before, there had been like many thousands of photo sharing startups that had gotten started because everyone wanted to be the next Instagram. It was sort of as Rise was starting. And there were 4 nuclear fusion startups in the world. And that seemed to me like wrong, or at least like a misallocation of risk reward. And I think one is that a lot of people have this thing, which is I need to first like start a company so that I can make $100 million in 3 years, and then I'm gonna do what I want. And actually, I think a lot of those people, if they would relax that very short time constraint, would go on to make a successful software company and then could do something else. But this thing of like, I gotta do this thing very quickly to solve this problem, and then I'm gonna go start a company, that seems to usually not work. And so I think people have this feeling, which is like, I can't take that much risk. It's like, it's this special time, I can start a software company, make all this money, and then I can like be free to do whatever I want, and I'll have already succeeded, and I won't be stressed. But then they're not willing to make a long-term commitment to that either. And even easy companies, no company is easy, but even things that people perceive as easy companies, it still takes like 10 years. And so you've still got to like really commit to do it well. And I actually think there's never been an easier time to start a hard company as your first company. I think in the current environment, it's easier to start a hard company than it is to start an easy company. Easy companies are boring. It is very hard to get the 10th or the 20th employee to join. It's very hard to like differentiate. There's hundreds of shots on goal for every good idea. And people don't care that much. And if you are starting like, a nuclear fusion company, even if the odds are against you, people really want to help you. You have this tailwind. People want to join you in the quest. And that is a super valuable thing, especially in a time when there's so much clutter and so much noise. And so I think that if you're going to start any company, it's like a 10-year commitment, and if it works. And it's not easy to start the easy company.
Something I remember, I can't remember who from the PayPal crew said, was that there used to be fewer of these sort of good startups, and so they would get more concentrated teams. Do you think that's a real phenomenon?
Huge problem. It is so hard right now to hire good people to be the early employees at a startup because they all just want to start their own. So if the mission doesn't matter, if it's not sort of this big quest that people want to join, then they're like, well, why would I be an employee and sort of not get the exposure, the learning, the status, the glory, 10 times, 20 times the equity, which I think is a huge mistake. Why not just like go start my own? And again, I think YC has some responsibility here.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna ask one last question, then we'll save a couple minutes for Q&A. My last question is, if you could, wave a wand, change anything about the tech startup entrepreneurship ecosystem, what would you change?
We've talked about this a few times, but if I could do one thing, it would be to get everyone in the ecosystem to take a much longer time horizon. I think this world where people start a company and plan to run it for 4 or 5 years, join a company and only plan to stay for 1 or 2, that's not how important shit gets done in the world. And having people willing to make a very long-term commitment to a hard problem, and from the outset, rather than say I'm going to do this thing as like a stepping stone to go start this other company or the company I'm really passionate about, or I'm going to work here for a year and then start my own company, or work here and then there and then there. I think that is so value destructive for a certain class of problems that if I could pick one thing, it would be to get people to make a long-term commitment to high risk, high reward problems. And that's easier said than done, and I'm in a place where it's easier for me to say that because I've already been as successful as I need to be, but that's still the one thing I would change.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, questions? I don't know if there's a mic set up. Yeah, I guess there's a mic going around in the back.
Sam, you mentioned that you joined OpenAI full-time, or made it your sole focus when you realized there was a plan to get from here to AGI. Can you just share your thinking around that plan?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing that I didn't realize initially is that the amount of compute available to sort of train one neural network is growing about 10x per year. And we have visibility to seeing that continue for the next 6 or 7 years. And most of the progress so far in machine learning has been this scaling it up. Like if you make a chart of the landmark result of each year, it basically uses 10x more compute than the previous year. And with another 6, 7, 8 orders of magnitude, we will be able to approach the human brain in scale. And I think we have to figure out a few more big ideas along the way for the algorithms, but not that many. It's mostly like if we can just scale it up, and I think now we know how to do that, new hardware and other things, that will go a very long way. And then I think in the big areas of intelligence, of sort of like unsupervised learning, reasoning, reinforcement learning, artificial life, we have sort of multiple attack vectors on each that all seem pretty promising.
Hi, Sam. Nice to meet you. You made 2 really interesting points. I thought one around entrepreneurs not really doing the hard stuff today, and then the other thing about people not sticking on terms of long time horizons. I wonder what you think in terms of how much of the people not doing hard stuff is due to the fact that it's harder to get funding for hard stuff to a certain extent. I think there are certain exceptions, Coastal Lab being one of them. But among many firms in the Valley, it's easier to fund the easy stuff. And the second question I have is with respect to the time horizon piece. Do you think if the standard contract was a 6-year vesting schedule as opposed to a 4-year vesting schedule, if that might change things?
Yeah, in terms of funding for hard stuff, I think it used to be true. It used to be almost impossible. And I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to Elon Musk, who's done more than anybody else to change investors' willingness to fund hard stuff. Also to Coastal Ventures and Founders Fund and a handful of other firms that sort of have stepped up. I think today, though, it's really gone the other way, and I want to get this message out. I think what we hear consistently from investors is like, we want to fund that stuff, right? Talking to YC. And when we started funding these companies at YC, they had a hard time raising money. They now have a much easier time raising money. I think people can sort of sense that all these things we've been talking about, the importance of concentrating talent, for example, and the difficulty of doing that without a big mission. So I actually think it has become much easier to raise at least the first 2 rounds for a hard tech company. It does get more difficult when you need to raise hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, but I suspect that will change too. In terms of vesting, yeah, I definitely think 6 is a lot better than 4, but I suspect the right answer for a lot of companies is 8 or 10. The note.
Sam, what are the 3 largest mistakes you see founders make that founders in this group are probably making? Like the most common things you see as mistakes that you would advise them to change?
In no order. One very common mistake is to not delegate enough to an executive team. Really great executives if they're good enough, they could go run a company if they wanted to. And I think people really value autonomy. And you can give them a vision, but you have to get, in my experience, you have to give them huge authority, much more than most founders find comfortable in what they do. And in my experience, I have been, on average, always surprised at the upside, even though I've had plenty of individual failures. And I think operating this way is uncomfortable to most founders, especially most first-time founders, especially when the people are more experienced and in many ways more talented than you. So this is like a systemic mistake that I think a lot of founders make. Another is not being willing to commit internally, externally, publicly, privately to a big vision. I often see founders that come in with a big vision or a lot of ambition, and then they kind of, the advisors around them, like I think most advice is usually terrible, but it's particularly bad in that it encourages people to have a smaller vision and not be so ambitious because people think it's scary or it's, it sounds too crazy. And so letting advisors push you off of what you actually believe, when really, like, all the best founders I know have incredible, unwavering confidence in their vision, even if they change course a few times on how they get there, is a really common mistake. And that affects everything. It affects how you hire people, how you retain them, how you keep a sense of momentum in the company, how you talk to the press. It's a huge issue. And then related to that, another thing that I see founders make, it's the other version of this. If you lose in short-term momentum, if there's like a period of time where the company, because you get distracted on something or you're sort of make a wrong bet and you lose short-term forward momentum, that's very hard to recover from. And I think most founders, until they've done that once, don't understand how expensive a mistake that is. And if they get it wrong, if you do lose momentum, you have to like do this like all-out effort to fix it. And the way you fix it is not what most people want to do, which is like give motivational speeches. It's just like get any win one at a time. And that can destroy a company if you don't do that quickly. One more?
Yeah, we can do one more.
So we had an interesting conversation about the abysmal absence of engineering ethics education and the catastrophic implications on our political system of the unintended consequences of social networking over the last 10 years. Would you mind expanding briefly on the word safe?
For AI specifically?
Oh, yeah. For AGI specifically.
For AGI specifically. We got a lot of criticism. Can I go a minute over time?
Yeah.
Okay. We got a lot of criticism recently for not releasing a full language model that we trained. And I was very surprised by the criticism. What we said is that, like, we think this is something that if the world does not adapt to, can have a catastrophic effect on political system and sort of manipulation of what people think. We can now generate text, like people can Photoshop images, and the world doesn't know about that yet. So we're going to do this controlled release. And I didn't think it was a particularly controversial decision, because that is like a baby step towards what's at stake with AGI. And the community had this incredibly negative reaction. All research has got to be open, it's got to be released, this is like fear-mongering to talk about this. The same journalist who would sort of say, like, Facebook was so irresponsible for not thinking ahead of time about the implications of what they were doing, was saying, like, I can't believe OpenAI is just not releasing their research here. And that has caused me a lot of pause, because compared to what's ahead of us, that was not even a warm-up. And I think what we mean by safe AGI is not just like, how do you not have the robots come after us, but how do you not cause harm to humans along the way? How do you make sure that this is used to make people's lives net better, not net worse? And I think the technology industry has generally failed to be thoughtful enough about this. To the credit of the industry, this is the internet is a complex system with a lot of emergent behavior. But the thing that scares me the most about safety around AI is that it is so hard to reason about. It's happening so quickly. The answers are so unclear and we don't seem to be in a place where we can have a reasonable discussion, because it's so loaded with emotion on all sides, that I worry the world is just not ready for it, and people will not move fast enough to really think about what's at stake here and the things that we have to do, many of which are uncomfortable to the industry and particularly sort of the AI research community, and what policymakers and we as society need to do. So I think that's going to be extremely difficult. And I feel less optimistic that we are societally ready for that conversation than I did 5 months ago.
Awesome. Well, I think that's our time. Sam, thank you for doing this.
Thanks.